this computer. All right, I think we're going.
Okay.
This is our second conversation in this series, talking to Obermann scholars about how this moment is resonating with their work. And one of the people that I've been eager to talk with is Lydia Maunz, who is on the Humanities for the Public Good Advisory Board and was also an Obermann Graduate Institute Fellow, and participated in Humanities Without Walls summer pre-doctoral workshop in Chicago, and probably has 50 other words. So, so Lydia, I'm going to let you tell us a little bit about the topic of your research and where you are in that process as well.
Okay. So I just last Friday, a week ago, I submitted my completed dissertation to my committee. So I'm preparing for my defense. I wrote a dissertation. It's called Testament of Grief, a cryptistemology of somatic loss in women's writing of the First World War, speaking of lots of words. And basically I wrote a dissertation about the ways that these First World War women in the writing that they generated so much of in response to the war, the ways they write about the body and its relationship to loss, specifically grief and trauma, and the ways that they use the language of disability to communicate their embodied sense of loss.
Is there maybe one writer, whether it's a diarist or a more official writer, who you could just give us a small example of?
Yeah, one, probably the most well-known, many of these women, people just have never heard of them before, myself included until I started this research, but the most well-known is Vera Brittain. They did a Hollywood movie of her based off of her memoir, the first part of her memoir, Testament of Youth, just a couple years ago. But she worked as a voluntary aid detachment nurse for much of the war, and she served in France and in Malta. But for her, she suffered some really devastating personal losses. Her fiance and her brother were both killed, and then two of her very best childhood friends were also killed. So she writes a lot, very frankly and straightforwardly about, in poetry and prose, about her experiences serving as a nurse and her losses.
And so, having been immersed, for years now in this literature, what is percolating for you right now in this moment?
I think I'm actually been quite stunned by how unexpectedly relevant this is. Just thinking about, we've kind of talked a little bit, the fact that we're shifting into a period with everything that's going on where people are having to confront, maybe not even recognizing it yet, but the reality of daily life involves a tremendous amount of loss on all different kinds of levels. And I think that the ways I have thought about that in such intimate connection to the body, I guess thinking about the ways so many of our bodies are kind of circumscribed or prescribed right now, does seem very relevant, very relevant.
Can you say a little more about that circumscribed, prescribed, and how that shows up in both eras, like now and then?
Well, I guess I'm thinking about the shelter in place orders, quarantining people literally. Like I talked to my brother last week, and he lives in Brooklyn, and he's essentially not left his apartment for had been almost 2 weeks when we spoke, and he's just kind of going stir crazy that literally are, for some people more so than others, radical changes to the way they kind of move in the world. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think about connections to the women that I wrote about, I mean, lived in a very different time, of course, with its own kind of prescriptions and expectations about femininity and what their bodies were not allowed to do. And one of the really interesting things that I encountered, I wrote in my last 2 chapters about nurses on the front, mostly nurses, not all. Some of them were volunteer, like ambulance drivers, but the ways they engage with the male body, especially in considering that was many of these women that wrote were upper middle class Edwardian women who had no contact with, were not supposed to have contact with male bodies in those ways. So yeah, I'm not sure if that was an answer to your question.
Yeah,
but
no, that's interesting. We were also talking about the difference in the current era versus what you're have been studying around death and dying and grief and mourning.
Yeah. So one of the big kind of trends, it's not quite the right word, but overarching considerations in my dissertation is some of the ways that dying have changed since, like, I am a 19th century British, that is technically my field of specialization. So looking at Victorian mourning practices to how we think about and respond to death and dying now. And I've noticed what I think are arguably some really significant changes. And I do think the First World War had a role to play in that. But, you know, the Victorian era was characterized as like a cult of mourning. People were, it was a part of people's everyday lives in ways that it just is not now. You know, there were elaborate rites and rituals around the process and experience of dying. I think people tended to have closer intimacy with the dying body, the person's body itself. And then I think with the war, I mean, it was such a terrible, bloody, just awful experience. And so many men, their bodies were not recovered. There were no bodies to bury, or there were no cemeteries to go to visit because they were, you know, thousands of miles away. And like Gallipoli, for example, that, and then combined as well with prescriptions against mourning. Women were not supposed to, in some instances, they were asked not to wear black or have events, any kind of show the world that they were grieving, because it was considered to be detrimental to morale. And I think those factors have contributed to what we see now with our current moment, where I think we are really profoundly illiterate in death and dying. We don't know how to talk about it. We don't know how to respond to it for ourselves. We don't know how to respond to people around us who are in states of grief. And as I really strongly believe that is very much to our detriment. So I think that my dissertation plays a role in that larger conversation too, which now is, of course, becoming really relevant as we see what's happening with the growth of this pandemic too. But
yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier about how I think a lot of us are in a certain stage of grief and mourning without necessarily even realizing it at this point. Again, because we're so ill-equipped, or that's just not a language that a lot of people are used to.
It's partly that, and partly the nature of the changes that we're experiencing. It's like things are happening so quickly. It doesn't even give you a chance to take stock and really think about like what in my life, what in my future is going to be gone from here on out. I mean, I don't even know. But yeah.
And so with this, with your project, you've been looking at written responses. And so what has this, and I know you were actually asked to mull this over via the Humanities for the Public Good Advisory Board, but what are you seeing as the uses of literature and writing to help process, understand, I don't know, culturally move through these periods of massive change and loss?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And that's one I've been really, personally struggling with, because on the one hand, there's something about the current moment that threatens to kind of invalidate the last 7 years of my life and the work that I've done. But I also, at the same time, I was realizing that my dissertation as a document in and of itself, and the primary text that it refers back to, all of these women's writing, is literally the most valid case for the use of the humanities in times of crisis, like global crisis like this, because these women, and so many of them, many women, they turned to literature and they turned to writing, and they wrote and they wrote and they wrote in response to these things that were happening, to these massive upheavals and also deeply personal losses. And they acknowledge that. Not all of them, but some of them explicitly acknowledge the fact that in the loss of so much of what they knew about their worlds and their lives, this was one thing that they could find solace in, and that really helped them kind of make sense of it after the fact, that helped them work through the psychological trauma. It was invaluable. And that has been a tremendous comfort to me, coming to the end of writing my dissertation and thinking about everything that's going on. So, yeah.
I was just going to ask if you're writing, but given that you just turned in your dissertation, I think I know the answer to that.
Not, although I am starting to feel the itch to go back in now, and because there are so many, it is a work in progress. There are things that I know need to be, that I want to develop more, and so I think I will be going back and doing more writing in the next couple of weeks.
And so as we're having this conversation, your robe is hanging in behind you.
Yeah.
And so also touching on this sense of personal grief and loss at this moment when you were prepared to walk across the stage in a few weeks.
Yeah.
How are you doing?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
It's then, in the scheme of things, I realize that it's not the most devastating thing, but for me personally, it has been a tremendous, not only disappointment, but it has been a sense of grief. I ordered my robe, and it came before all of this happened, and now it's just kind of hanging there. I'm trying to think of ways that I can might be able to create kind of my own ceremony or celebration. But I was really anticipating, and I think relying on the ritual of the ceremony and the ritual of going through these final steps to help me mark the end of this. And instead, I feel like it's just kind of left hanging in this undefined, amorphous space where it has the potential to, I don't know, it is a source of sorrow for sure. And then also the fact of being in this moment and thinking about jobs. And, as we talked about before, I've spent 7 years really kind of trying to think about and plan as much as possible for the kinds of careers that I might want. And now the fact that I'm sitting at this juncture and considering the reality that the future that I literally planned for doesn't exist right now. It's not to say that doesn't also involve a tremendous sense of possibility and generative creative potential, but it is a loss. It is a difficult thing. So yeah, I've been been affecting me in personal ways as well, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, and my hope is that those who have this really deep knowledge around some of these issues around grief and mourning, I think are going to be more needed than ever. So
yeah,
I have faith that will actually come to fruition.
I hope so. I think it's important.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's been fun to talk about all of this and kind of really consider its significance in the larger context of right now. So yeah, it's helpful for me.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.